Good evening, everyone. You are watching Direct Line Live. Our guest this evening is Dan Mitchell, president of the Center for Freedom and Prosperity. Welcome to the show, Dan. And our hosts tonight are myself, Dwight Patel, and Mark Unkefer.
Thank you.
Oh, it's great to be with you guys.
Great, Dan. And why don't you first describe a little bit about how you set up the Center for Freedom and Prosperity?
Well, I created the Center for Freedom and Prosperity back in 2000, primarily initially to work on international tax issues, because this is when some of these international bureaucracies were trying to harmonize taxes and they were attacking so-called tax havens. And I wanted there to be a group set up specifically to fight that battle, because I think tax competition is a very good way of limiting the greed of politicians. And so I set it up. I hired a friend of mine to run it, and at the beginning it was mostly on these international tax issues, sort of a niche topic, but one that I think is very important. And then over the years we've just evolved so that we cover a lot more issues. My friend unfortunately passed away, so I either had to shut it down or take it over myself. And so I said, well, I'll be my own boss. That has certain advantages, and so I've been running the center directly now ever since 2017, and just doing a lot of writing and speaking about all sorts of different economic issues, with fiscal policy, taxes, and spending really being my bread and butter issue.
So one of the areas that has generated in the international tax arena some considerable attention are sort of the net zero proposals, the idea of imposing carbon tax or carbon tariffs. And have those initiatives receded? Are they still a problem? Where does that stand now with sort of the movement back towards sanity?
Well, this is an area where President Trump has been very, very helpful, because he basically has told the Europeans and others to go basically jump in a lake. The U.S. didn't even attend the most recent big COP conference, as they call it, where they try to impose all these sort of binding restrictions on energy usage. Because this is a very serious problem. You look at why countries like Germany and the United Kingdom have such weak economies. Their energy costs are way out of whack with the rest of the world. You can't have a competitive manufacturing sector. And for Germany, especially, because they've historically been so successful with their manufacturing, they've made their economy uncompetitive. So the United Kingdom and Germany, which are two of the countries that have gone the farthest in this direction, they're suffering deep economic stagnation. And unfortunately, their green parties have so much influence and power. I don't see them fixing themselves anytime soon. And so kudos to President Trump. I mean, I disagree with him on some issues, but on this issue, he has it exactly right. We're not going to deliberately impoverish our country, especially, I mean, even if you believe in all the global warming stuff, China is building hundreds of coal-fired plants every year. India is dramatically increasing their carbon output as they industrialize and get richer. So you'd be sacrificing your own economy and achieving absolutely nothing, even if you believe in the most dire predictions about global warming.
It does seem that some of the proposals in the global warming arena had a kind of redistribution component to it. The idea that the rich world would compensate poor countries as part of some kind of grand bargain. Again, has that receded, or are we really just relying on Trump these days to have the club in the closet, or the club that's out being wielded to push those proposals back?
There's no such thing as a permanent victory in politics. And so if we were to wind up with President AOC after the 2028 elections, this stuff could all spring back to life, because it's still there. They're still doing these conferences, all these other countries in the world just about. I mean, really the only ally the U.S. has in fighting this stuff now is like Javier Milei down in Argentina. The Chinese, of course, pretend to be in favor of this because they know that the West is cutting its own throat. So they're more than happy to pretend to be part of it, even though, as I said, they're building hundreds of coal-fired plants every year and things like that. So we should not rest easy. I think for the next 3 years, this stuff will be mostly dormant. There will be individual countries, as I said, like Germany and the UK, hurting their own economies, but there's no sort of global threat of sort of global carbon tax harmonization while Trump's in the White House. But believe me, that stuff will come roaring back to life if you get some left-wing president in the US after the next presidential election.
So let me turn to an area where you do disagree with the president, with the administration, and that is tariffs. So kind of in an elevator kind of summary, elevator speech summary, what's your take on these tariff proposals?
Well, first of all, tariffs are taxes. I mean, if the government's taking money from you at the point of a gun, it's a tax. It's not a fee or anything like that. So President Trump has unilaterally imposed all these taxes by, I think, misreading the law. Of course, the Supreme Court very soon is going to decide on that issue. But, you know, the reality is right now we have all these major taxes increases that he has imposed on imports coming into the country. And I just don't think that's a good idea economically. 56% of the goods that are imported into America are intermediate goods. They're goods that American companies use as inputs in their manufacturing process. So we've had 9 straight months of declines in manufacturing employment because steel tariffs, aluminum tariffs, all these other tariffs are making it more expensive for American companies to operate. So I think Trump is just wrong on trade. Now, if he was simply saying China is a country that has not been playing by the rules, China subsidizes their exports, China's a potential geopolitical foe, if he was to say, we're going to restrict trade with China, I'd be open to that. It's a foreign policy issue, really more than an economic issue. And, you know, I don't pretend to be a foreign policy expert. So if he was just targeting China, that might be a very legitimate thing to do. But he's imposing tariffs on Singapore, on Switzerland, on all these countries that basically have no tariffs against American products. So he has just always had this, I think, mistaken view that trade is bad. And you know, we should have learned in the 1930s when Herbert Hoover had the Smoot-Hawley tariff, we should have learned that protectionism is a bad idea. So I think Trump's policies are unfortunately misguided, and he's undermining his own political status and his own economic record because these taxes on trade are hurting manufacturing. They're causing prices for many important goods to be higher than they should be. And you're seeing that reflected in some of the disapproval polls about Trump's record on the economy. So I really wish he would get rid of some of the bad advisors like Peter Navarro and bring in some more economists who could say, look, you've done so many good things, lowering the U.S. corporate tax rate. You're doing things like moving toward expensing of business investment. These are things that will make American companies more competitive. And as long as we don't hurt our own companies with too much red tape, too much taxes and things like that, American companies can compete with anybody anywhere in the world. And Trump just needs to have the confidence to know that his good tax policy and his good deregulation policy, that's what he should focus on. We don't need trade barriers that are actually backfiring on American manufacturers.
And you know, with I was saying back with the tariffs, I mean, a lot of this stuff is stuff we used to fight against in the 90s. You remember, this is Bob Kerry's campaign for president, putting tariffs on Japan and foreign tariffs. I mean, we're free traders, you know, frankly, and free trade has been very good to this country, frankly, for over the years.
Yeah, the U.S. is one of the most competitive economies in the world. We're always one of the top 2 or 3 exporters in the world, if not the top exporter in the world. The U.S. companies will outcompete anybody so long as the government isn't imposing too many tax and regulatory burdens. I mean, things like, our permitting process in the United States is a travesty. You
Oh, yeah.
literally have to go through years and years of bureaucracy just to get the approval to dig a new mine. And so we are hurting ourselves. And my view is we should fix the bad policies that are hurting American businesses. We shouldn't be trying to restrict trade with other countries. Unless there's some argument that this other country is a potential foe, is rampantly cheating on their own trade policy and things like that. But when we're talking about Latin America and Europe, these are countries that trade freely with us, and we should trade freely with them.
So we were talking before about the changes in Argentina, which is kind of, frankly, a bit of a pendulum. You talk about the change in politics globally, what happens in 3 years with the taxes on aimed at CO2 reduction. Argentina has swung one way and the other. Right now, it's very much swinging in the free market direction. How sustainable do you think those changes are?
Well, as I already said, there is no such thing as a permanent victory in politics, but what's happening in Argentina today is frankly miraculous, because when you're talking about a pendulum, for 75 years, the pendulum has been way over on the left with the Peronists. And even when they had supposedly center-right parties occasionally in power, they were basically no more than what we used to call Rockefeller Republicans or big government Republicans. And so Argentina has literally been the worst performing economy in the world for a long, long time. And it got so bad a couple of years ago with hyperinflation and economic stagnation and rising poverty and unemployment that the voters of Argentina did something that nobody expected. They elected a wild, crazy, and I say this in a positive way, a wild, crazy libertarian, Javier Milei, to their White House. It's actually the Pink House, Casa Rosada. But they elected Javier Milei as president, and literally within 2 months, he balanced the budget. Within less than a year, he brought inflation from well over 200% down to about 25%, and it's still heading down. He's deregulating, and what's really miraculous is even though he basically has said no to all the interest groups, he's cut all sorts of spending, the largest peacetime spending cut in world history, reducing the burden of government by 6 percentage points of GDP. He did all that. We just back in the end of October had midterm elections, and everyone was thinking, oh my God, these voters are going to be so tired of Javier Milei and the fact that he's cutting spending and saying no to all the interest groups. Everyone thought the Peronists, the left-wingers, were going to win the midterm elections. Instead, Javier Milei's Libertarian Party won a landslide victory. So I'm incredibly hopeful that Argentina is going to show the entire rest of the world, if you do good policy, because it's basically Reaganism, Thatcherism on steroids. If you do good policy, not only can you turn your economy around very rapidly, which he's done, it's one of the fastest growing economies in the world now, but you can also get politically rewarded. In other words, the voters, okay, maybe they were used to having their hands out and treating government like Santa Claus, but even the Argentinian voters who for 75 years were voting for these left-wing Peronists, they realized, wait, he cured hyperinflation, poverty is coming down rapidly, private incomes are going up, employment is going up, investment is pouring into the country. We've balanced our budget. We're not, mooching off the IMF anymore. And so hooray for Argentinian voters. They actually were mature and adult enough to realize, okay, we can't treat government as a piñata or as Santa Claus, but if we allow free markets and give Javier Milei the support to do more spending cuts, more free trade, more deregulation, Argentina, I mean, you go back before the Peronists took over, Argentina was one of the 10 richest countries in the world. I have every expectation that Javier Milei can make Argentina one of the richest countries in the world once again. He's off to a great start, and I'm so excited that the voters of Argentina gave him a big victory in the midterm elections, because we know in the U.S., midterm elections normally go against the party in power. But in Argentina, by being really hardcore free market, Javier Milei has delivered not only huge economic benefits, but a giant political victory in those midterm elections at the end of October.
So let's turn to the United States. You've done really good work on comparing the migration pattern and the connection that has with tax rates, income tax rates especially, but tax rates in general among the states. And I guess that's one of the benefits of our federal system is you almost get a laboratory, don't you, of seeing which states attract economic activity and which states basically drive it someplace else. Can you expand on that? And what are the trends that we're seeing now?
Yeah, the United States has a decentralized or federalist system, as we call it. We're not the best country in the world about having federalism. Switzerland wins that prize. But our system, our federal government is too big, but states we still have 50 states who have their own tax policies, their own spending policies, and all the other policies as well. Obviously, they don't have their own trade policies, but there's lots of ways that the states are different from each other. And it's amazing. You look at the 50 states, it's like a laboratory experiment where we have 50 experiments with some states being low tax and free market, and some states being class warfare and lots of regulation and red tape. And we're seeing exactly what you might expect to see as an economist. We're seeing that jobs and investment are going from high tax states like New York and California and Illinois, and they're going to low tax states like Tennessee and Texas and Florida. And we have data from the IRS on how much adjusted gross income moves from one state to another. That's showing the same thing. There was just a very, very good report in the Financial Times, the big business newspaper out of London. The Financial Times looked at records of where are businesses moving, and they found the exact same thing. Businesses are moving to states with lower taxes, lower burdens of government spending, less red tape. And so this laboratory experiment we call the United States of America, these 50 experiments are telling us exactly what the world is telling us. Around the world, low tax, free market economies grow faster, create more jobs, create more wealth, deliver more broadly based prosperity. And the same thing is true in the United States when you're looking at the states. So I think anybody who cares about real world evidence, whether they're looking at international evidence or they're looking at this 50 state evidence that we're talking about right now, it's a slam dunk victory for free markets and limited government. Nobody wants to set up a new business in some place like Illinois when you can do the same thing in a free market, low tax state like Florida.
So it's interesting. One way to look at this is to focus on the very high tax jurisdictions, the New Yorks and the Californias, and say Texas and Florida with no income tax. But another of the trends that's also interesting that your work focuses on is the impact of going from a graduated income tax to a flat tax and basically having lower total rates coming down. Can you expand on that as kind of how the differences between the jurisdictions that make that choice?
Yeah, well, we have in the United States, we have, depending on how you count it, 8 or 9 states with no income tax whatsoever. Right. Washington State has a capital gains tax. So is that the same as having no income tax? Not really. So 8 or 9. And then you have probably about 8 or 9 states that are very high tax class warfare states with state income taxes, in some cases like 13.3% in California. I can get to 14% if you live in New York City. You have states like Oregon and New Jersey that have high income tax rates. Minnesota is another one that's very anti-competitive, uncompetitive. And so the evidence is very, very clear. The best thing you can do as a state is to have no state income tax. The second best thing you can do as a state is to have a state flat tax. And a whole bunch of states in the last 5 years have moved toward a flat tax. I live in Virginia, but I went to school in Georgia. You can see my Georgia Bulldog stuff. Right. Georgia's moved to a flat tax, as have many other states like Iowa. About probably 6 or 7 states around the country have moved to a flat tax in recent years. And then you have sort of middle ground states who have so-called progressive systems, but it's really the so-called progressive systems with the super high tax rates. that's when you're cutting your own throat. That's when you're driving out entrepreneurs, you're driving out businesses, you're making your state very, very uncompetitive. And with the way that you see politics developing in the United States, where you have this sort of political sorting, left-wing people move to California, right-wing people move to Texas and Florida. And so states like California are getting worse over time. They're not getting better. They're not waking up and realizing, wait, we're driving out businesses. We're driving out entrepreneurs and investors. No, they're attracting more and more bad voters. And of course, they're driving out the good voters. So it's really remarkable what we're seeing around the country. In some sense, it's almost more powerful than the evidence we see around the world. And I've always relied on that data to show people that it's much better to have small government.
Do we have evidence yet? Some of the states that have caught either reduced the total rate to gone to a flat tax or reduced rates gradually. I think of a number, as you mentioned. Georgia, North Carolina did the same thing. Close to us, West Virginia has dramatically changed its tax rates. Are we beginning to see those kinds of policy changes pay off?
Well, I think North Carolina is actually a very good example. Starting about 10 years ago, they dramatically cut back on the growth of government spending. They started dramatically lowering tax rates, including moving to a flat tax. And North Carolina's fiscal position, I think the last time I checked, and the Tax Foundation puts out something called the State Tax Competitiveness Index, North Carolina was as low as 44, if you go back to, I think, to the 2013 or 2014 edition. And now they're one of the best states in the country. So that's a dramatic change from being one of the bottom 10 states to now being up near the top. So North Carolina, I think, is a great success story. Now, there are states like South Dakota, New Hampshire, Florida, who have been in the top 10, top 5 all along. And obviously, that's the best thing of all. You sort of never made the mistake of becoming a class warfare state. So I think North Carolina deserves more attention. And actually, you know who else deserves attention? And this will surprise you, Colorado. Not because the current governor of Colorado or the current state legislature are any good, but voters in Colorado back in, I think it was 1992, enacted by referendum something called the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which is a spending cap. And they also got a flat tax back in the 1990s. So Colorado, even though it's considered now a blue state, they have the best spending cap in the country by far, and they have a flat tax. And that has enabled the Colorado economy, even though it has left-wingers in control, because of the rules of the state constitution, those politicians are handcuffed. They can't do so-called progressive discriminatory tax rates. They can't bust the budget. Basically, spending cannot grow faster than inflation plus population in Colorado. So I don't recommend the current political leadership of Colorado, but boy, the combination of a spending cap and a flat tax has really been a saving grace for that state. Because the voters would like to turn it into another California, but they can't because the state constitution has those two very good provisions.
And, furthermore, along the lines of that, in Florida, there's been rumblings about Ron DeSantis wanting to eliminate even property taxes. I think that will probably just create like a major boom for the state of Florida. I mean, that might even eclipse Texas with, you imagine living there, you don't have to even pay a property tax, no income tax, all you do is paying a sales tax.
Well, Texas and Florida, of course, are already booming at the expense of states like California, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, and so on and so forth. But you're exactly right. If Florida can continue to have good spending discipline, because by the way, let me just digress here for a second. Republicans love to cut taxes. That's fine. We're all old enough to remember Bob Novak, and he was a great journalist, and he said, the only reason God put Republicans on earth is so they could cut taxes. So I'm all in favor of cutting taxes, but guess what? If you do not restrain the growth of government spending, any good tax policy you have is eventually going to go away. And Milton Friedman was right, the great free market economist. He said the true tax burden in your country is how much the government is spending. because they're either going to tax you today or they're going to tax you in the future because of all your deficits and debt. So you have to control government spending. And Ron DeSantis, to his credit, let me give you a factoid. California, New York, if you compare New York and Florida, New York and Florida have roughly the same population. Florida is now a little bit bigger because there's so much in-migration and so many people are moving out of New York, but they're pretty much the same size states. New York spends more than twice as much as Florida. And what are you getting? Your state government is twice as big. What are you getting for that money? Are you getting better schools? No. Are you getting better roads? No. Are you getting better hospitals or anything like that? No. By the way, this is the same argument I make when I give speeches in Europe. I was in France, I think it was last year or the year before, and I said, okay, your burden of government spending in France is 57% of GDP. Right next door in Switzerland is 32% of GDP. So not quite twice as big, but a huge gap. And I asked this audience in France, do you have better schools than Switzerland? Nobody raised their hand. Do you have better education than Switzerland? Nobody raised their hand. Do you have better health? I went through all the possible things that you might think government should do. And as a libertarian, of course, I don't want government to do much of anything, but whatever. I asked these people in France, is there anything your government is doing better than the Swiss government? And none of them could point out anything that the French government was doing better. And yet the French government is spending vastly more money than the Swiss government. So you don't need big bloated governments to have decent public services in your country. Just like you don't need big bloated government on the state level to have decent services in your state. And so the comparison of New York and Florida, just like the comparison of France and Switzerland, again, I don't want to overuse what I've already said before, but the arguments are slam dunk arguments in favor of smaller government and lower taxes. You just need competent, honest public officials and not sort of this free-for-all Santa Claus buy votes with other people money approach that you get in some states and some countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much like that. Just in Maryland, there was a study released how Maryland has increased spending on public education. They're spending more per student than they were just 5 years ago. And you'd think test scores would go up. You think graduation rates would go up. No, they're down. Test scores are down. Reading proficiency is down. And, their idea is throwing money at the problem. And I mean, we saw out of control spending during the Bush years where we had a really good tax policy, but the spending was kind of going out of control there.
Yeah. Well, actually, Dwight, this gives me an opportunity to raise another issue. We already talked about how we've seen a lot of positive progress on the state level in terms of states lowering their tax rates and adopting flat taxes. Probably even better news is the fact that over the last 5 years, we've had about a dozen states adopt school choice. Now, unfortunately, Maryland's not one of them on your side of the river, and on my side of the river, Virginia's not one. But you have all sorts of states that now have sweeping school choice plans, and this is leading to better educational outcomes, better test scores, parents and students that are happier with better options for their education. So I think what we're seeing on school choice at the state level is one of the just best political public policy stories you could possibly imagine, because you're not just doing better policy, you're creating a better future for your state with these kinds of reforms. And so, I always point out, it's like Florida, Indiana, and Arizona are the three best states, but there are now about 15 to 20 other states that have at least partial or full school choice. And so this is a really, really positive development. And hopefully it'll come to Maryland and Virginia at some point, because again, the evidence is so clear. Instead of pouring more money into a failing government school system, create choice, create competition. By the way, the academic evidence is that when you create school choice, you also improve the government schools, because all of a sudden the bureaucrats know they need to improve, otherwise they'll lose students. So competition is a wonderful thing in the economy. It's great to have grocery stores compete with each other. It's great to have banks compete with each other. Well, guess what? It's great to have schools compete with each other too. You get better results when there's competition in your society.
Yeah, and the proof on that is, American auto industry, and then through the 50s, 60s, and to the good part of the 70s, the cars were lousy, but nobody's buying Toyotas, no one was buying Hondas. And then when we had the foreign competition, American cars got better as a result. And that's the way schools, and I agree, that's how schools and so on, competition makes for better teachers too.
Exactly.
Let's turn to another subject. The center has written quite a bit on GSCs, government-sponsored entities, enterprises, and in the mortgage market, I think sometimes it's not appreciated just how expansive the role of government-sponsored institution is. In light of the whole discussion about affordability of housing and prices going up, can you elaborate on kind of what are the free market solutions that could address some of those issues?
Well, I think the first thing for all of our viewers to understand is that the government-sponsored enterprises, the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they're the big reason we had a financial crisis back in 2008. You had politicians saying, oh, we need to expand our affordable housing goals. Well, that sounds nice. Everyone likes affordable housing. But when the mandates result in banks basically being told, give housing loans to anybody, no or very low down payments, very little concern about credit. And the banks were willing to do it because right away they could package those loans into a security and sell it to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, under law, were obliged to buy all these securities as part of their affordable lending goals. And guess what? We wound up having a housing crisis and a financial crisis and almost destroyed our economy. So to me, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are these cancers on the economy. Politicians have put them in because, oh, we have to make housing more affordable. But if you simply increase demand for housing and in effect tell financial institutions they have to give loans to people who aren't creditworthy, that's never going to work in the long run. I think the big problem we have is that you have too many restrictive zoning laws and regulations on the housing market. 25% plus of the cost of a new house is just government red tape.
Oh,
that's assuming that you're even allowed to build a house, because in
I'm trying to build a house right now.
In California, the zoning laws make it impossible to build new housing just about anywhere. And so when you're not allowed to build new housing, so you can't get more supply, and the government is subsidizing demand, of course prices are going up and making it unaffordable.
Like right now, I bought land in Anne Arundel County to build a house there. I'm still waiting on permitting. It has been over a year. And a friend of mine who's on the council said, oh, it's going to take about another 18 months before you get the break ground and start building. It is insanity,
Well, but let me come back to the mortgage market and talk about, because there has been some discussion about in this administration doing some GSE reform. What are your thoughts about the direction? Is there a way of getting those institutions to have less of a, how shall I say, domination of those markets?
Well, right now, ever since the financial crisis, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have been in conservatorship. In effect, the GSE form of bankruptcy. Now, the shareholders, because these are nominally private companies, even though they're government chartered and government politicians appoint their board members and stuff like that. The GSEs want to get out of conservatorship so they can go back to the good old days, at least what they considered the good old days, like 2006, 2007. I think that's a mistake. And I think, unfortunately, Trump is leaning in that direction. We should be getting government out of the housing market, not making Fannie and Freddie more powerful. I guess we'll have to wait and see what Trump does. But I'm worried at some of the signals that we're seeing that he wants to sort of let Fannie and Freddie loose again. And the last time we did that, boy, we should have learned. We touched a hot stove. We didn't just burn our finger. We burned our whole arm. So the last thing I want to do is let those two monsters out of their cage again.
Very true.
So there does seem to be a kind of unintended consequences phenomena that we see again and again in the housing market of, again, proposals that are intended to make things affordable, having the impact of driving prices up and making things more expensive, which then creates this. We got to come up with new ideas. The 50-year mortgage was another one. Again, elaborate. So assuming we reduce the role of GSE, will we bring banks back? Would we be able to have the kind of long-term loans that we are used to? Kind of what would the market look like in a free market system?
One of the big things that you get in a free market is you would get matching of long-term people who wanted long-term assets would finance long-term investments like mortgages. Historically, we've had financial institutions like banks who take short-term deposits, and we've expected them to make the long-term investments in housing. And of course, we saw with the savings and loan crisis when the government had inflation in the 70s and 80s, that led to the destruction of the savings and loan industry. We had the financial crisis with the easy money from the Fed and Fannie and Freddie underwriting all these dodgy loans. Get the government out of the way. I'm not going to pretend to know exactly what the housing market will look like if we had a genuine free market. It might very well be that we'll go back to the days before Fannie and Freddie, where people actually saved up a little bit longer and actually had 20% to put down on a house. Because once you're putting 20% down on a house, you're actually invested in the house. And presumably your home loan won't ever go underwater. So you won't have an incentive to walk away from your house like we had during the financial crisis, where a lot of people borrowed money and then just sort of said, well, whatever, I'm not going to pay it back. And that was one of the contributors to the crisis. So I want to have free markets. I don't know exactly what the free market will do, but I know one thing for sure: the free market is not going to create another financial crisis like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac did.
And on that same note, we're kind of seeing that kind of happen. I've got a couple friends of mine who are in the automotive industry who are telling me, because they give away car loans like candy, and now with the economic slowdown, they are seeing repossessions, and we're about to see. They think the bottom's about to fall out of the car market, which would be devastating to the economy overall, and that's all stems from easy money.
Yeah, well, here's the thing people don't understand. Politicians, and we see this with Republicans and Democrats, they're always badgering the Fed. Lower interest rates. Because if you have low interest rates, at least in the short run, you're giving the economy a sugar high. You're goosing the economy. But if your artificially low interest rates are encouraging people to go more in debt, and whether we're talking about corporate debt, whether we're talking about consumer credit debt, whether we're talking about auto loan debts, whether we're talking about student loan debts. I mean, I think it's a mistake to encourage too much debt in your economy. We should be encouraging more equity, more saving.
Yes, absolutely.
And yet all of our policies, politicians basically want to make things appear less costly than they really are. Yeah. And when you're screwing up the price signals in your economy and you're encouraging people to take on too much debt, the moment there's an economic slowdown, much less an economic downturn, guess what? What was it Warren Buffett said? When the tide goes out, you can tell who's actually wearing a bathing suit. Well, when the economic tide goes out, you find out who's taken on too much debt. And the problem is politicians are the ones who are encouraging excessive debt in our economy. And this goes above and beyond, of course, the own debt that they create with their excessive government spending. So, yeah, I worry we have far too much both private and government debt in our nation.
I mean, that's very true. And I always encourage, savings. And I remember back when bank interest rates were below 1%, and I'm like, this is just a war on people who save money. It's a war on savers. I benefit nothing from a 0% car loan when I'm saving the money, because my bank's only giving less than 1/10 of 7%,
Yep. That technically in economics, that's called financial repression. Government, in effect, stealing money from savers by holding returns artificially low.
Mm-hmm. Mark.
So let's turn to, we talked about, let me come back to the tariff issue, because we're waiting obviously on the Supreme Court decision. We've got multiple negotiations. We certainly have this interesting situation with Canada, which is integrated into the auto industry, and the transfers, the transactions going back and forth are ending up more expensive. Now, one of the arguments that's been made for tariffs, that it's interesting, the people imposing the tariffs now really haven't made, they've talked about giving back a rebate, whatever, is that it is potentially a new tax that would help fund the huge budget deficit. It would be a kind of backdoor VAT, if you will, obviously targeted because it's only on trade, on imports. How much does that argument that, again, as I said, really isn't being made, but I guess could be made on behalf of the tariffs, how much does that hold water?
Well, we see President Trump basically saying that, oh, if we follow my trade policy of protectionism and higher taxes on trade, maybe we can get rid of the income tax. I'm sorry, the math just doesn't work.
Right.
When you're looking at the individual income tax, the payroll tax, the corporate income tax, these are all taxes on income. You're talking about $3 trillion of revenue. And even with Trump's very high tariffs, we're talking about a couple of $100 billion of tax revenue. You can't get rid of $3 trillion of tax revenue with a tax that only raises a couple of $100 billion. So the math is nonsensical. Now, if he was talking about going back to the size of government we had in the 1800s, when we had no income tax and we basically relied on tariff revenue and some excise taxes, I'll take that in a heartbeat. But I'll take that because government at the federal level was only consuming 2 to 3% of GDP rather than 24, 25% of GDP. Unless Donald Trump has a secret plan that he's never revealed to us to dramatically downsize the burden of Washington, it's nonsense to say that we're going to use these tariff taxes to get rid of the income tax.
Yep. And I mean, it sounds great. I'm a big zero tax kind of guy. I think taxes are evil. I think taxes is theft. But yeah, I don't see the math adding up to just using tariffs and custom fees to pay for the running of the country.
Again, unless you're going to basically, you'd have to go back to the kind of federal government America's founding fathers envisioned, which is basically, I think it was called the night watchman state, where the government defends the shores and polices the streets. If you have a government that focuses on just those core responsibilities, yes, we could easily get rid of the income tax and we could finance the government with some modest tariffs. But that's not what they're talking about.
Right.
No.
So tell me some of the activities that you have that you want to promote that the center is in the process of doing. We're kind of at that point in the show when we kind of look forward to giving people a chance to tell what's coming up.
Well, because I'm a think tanker, my organization is what they call a 501c3, a nonprofit. I'm not directly involved with politics. My life is basically researching and writing and speaking about different economic issues and trying to educate people. And whether I'm trying to educate politicians, whether I'm talking to journalists, whether I'm doing a program like this, my job is to basically be a teacher, but not a teacher in a classroom, someone who tries to take these economic issues, which frankly are common sense. I mean, you grow your economy with investment and production. You don't grow your economy with debt and government. So I think a lot of what I say is simply common sense. And my particular niche that I think the role I fill is I look at all this international and domestic evidence comparing states and countries, because again, I think this laboratory we have, both internationally and domestically, creates such powerful evidence in favor of limited government. And of course, my trusty sidekick who keeps trying to get in the camera here helps me out.
I should say that I sympathize with you. My sidekicks, I have two of them. They're sound asleep, or they're either sound asleep or they're camera shy. I don't know which. But
this one is not. There's another one here that's camera shy, but
right.
This one is always climbing on me, whether I'm talking to my computer or just writing on it. She seems to think her job is to get between me and the screen.
Okay. And Dwight, we have a couple of events coming up.
Yes, we do. We have our Maryland Republican Party convention, which is this Saturday in beautiful Towson, Maryland. It'll be a little cold, but we're not having snow, so that's good. And then Sunday we have our Montgomery County Republican Club Christmas party over in Bethesda, Maryland. Everyone is welcome. It's free to attend. We just ask you to bring an unwrapped toy for a United States Marine Corps Toys for Tots Drive. And those are our events. Oh, we have Pizza and Politics tomorrow night in Olney. Those are our events. Yeah.
Well, Dan, thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time, and give your cat kudos too for giving silent testimony in support.
Well, now that the show's coming to a close, she suddenly decided to lay down and not be on the screen anymore. So her timing is impeccable.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Dan. Great show. We'll love to have you back on in a later date, but for myself, Mark, and everyone else, good night. We'll see everyone next week.
Great.
Good talking to you guys.
Let's go down to Missoni, where Italian cuisine shines. Let's go down to Missoni's, we'll have a good